Evolutionary.org Hardcore 2.0, episode 88 coming your way. Today's going to be a fun episode, something that doesn't get talked about out there in the bodybuilding world. We're talking about stacking two orals with Para Pharma. And look, stacking two orals, we see this done a lot by pros. We see them stack more than two orals. We see them stack 3, 4, 5 orals even on a cycle. Orals have advantages that a lot of people don't realize, and we're going to talk about that. We're kind of debate that on this podcast. Mobster and I, we're gonna talk about different issues that you can have when it comes to stacking orals, and is it really an issue? We're gonna talk about how to keep your health A plus on these oral stacks. We're gonna talk about Para Pharma oral stack IDs. We're gonna go through which ones you can stack. We're gonna go through the dosing, how long, and all that stuff. Give you some ideas that you can start experimenting with. And then we're going to talk about why Para Pharma is a great choice. This is going to be a really fun episode. So let's start about Mobster. Talk about first, is stacking orals really an issue? Why don't you give your thoughts on that?
The short answer is no. Okay. I mean, that's just oversimplified answer because we're going to give you some guidance to argue against it. So listen, Stevesmi and I are aware and discussed this obviously in a pre-show. And I guarantee you, Steve, if we've got 100 people, and it will be a lot more than 100, but if 100 people are listening to the show right now, as we are talking, there will be 20 or 30 people going, hey, 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 waving their hands in the air and saying, what about this? What about that? So we're going to cover that. Right? The short and simple answer when it comes to PEDs is people will do what they want to do. That's obvious. So if we're talking in terms of risk factors, running trend has a risk, running high dosage of injectable steroids has a risk, running one stack after another stack, blasting and cruising, all these things have risk, okay? And then we could measure them up against other things that we do in life, drinking, smoking, using recreational drugs, driving too fast, risky behavior that we did as kids, risky behavior that we do now, risking relationships by shagging outside the relationship, and a bunch of other things. And everything, Steve, everything now comes with a fucking warning on it in terms of trying to protect ourselves. So listen, we understand completely the arguments in terms of the risk factor associated with using a singular oral, never mind a double, two orals or more together. So the obvious argument is thus, and it literally comes down to the way the oral steroids have been designed to be utilized by the body. So there's a whole first pass through the liver, oral toxicity, and so on and so forth. To be honest, guys, this applies to some of the over-the-counter medications that you guys will buy for pain and anti-inflammation, and so on and so forth, in cream form, pill form, capsule form, gels, you like it. Just ibuprofen, Steve, will come with a warning insert. And arguably, Steve, using over-the-counter medication because it's over-the-counter and considering it to be safe is actually a risk of behavior in and of itself. To the point of, and I've told this story before, people like and including up to Dorian Yates, Mr. Olympia, overusing excessively high doses for long periods of time, an anti-inflammatory, i.e. Advil and ibuprofen, which fucked his stomach up and caused bleeding. And it was because he was treating the various strains and pains and tears, etc., that he'd had just before he retired as Mr. Olympia. The same thing applies. I've had pain medication given to me, Steve, that it has to be treated in the same way for when I had the spinal issue in 2016, and I had to have another medication with it to stop it ripping the fuck out of my stomach. So we understand that singular orals can arguably have an effect on your organs, on specifically those organs which are filtering the blood. And the steroid's been broken down by your body, passes into the blood, and the filters of our blood are where the risk factor increases. So the argument becomes, never, this is the stuff that you hear, never run orals for more than 4 weeks. Well, that's bullshit. We know it's bullshit. And I don't just mean genetic freaks wanting to win the Mystery Olympia and $500,000, hopefully this year, for example, taking a risk of using lots of orals for long periods of time, or even short periods of time. 100 milligrams of Debo, 100 milligrams of Divanivir is not uncommon, especially for competing. And that's just amateur, never mind professional bodybuilders, and so on and so forth. And there's an obvious argument, and I've used this before, and it's on a dose for dose basis. If you say on a dose-for-dose basis that 100 milligrams of an oral is more risky in terms of the effect it can have on your body than 100 milligrams of injectable. I would agree. But when we start to compare like with like, we actually start to realize, and I've used this argument before, singular oral, Anavar is a good example, run at the optimal dosage, let's say 50 milligrams per day, which is what I've always assumed it to be, and it seems to work for most people as being an optimal dosage to get the best effects. You're looking at 350 milligrams a week. That's 7 times 50. If you take an injectable steroid and you say the classic would be testosterone, any form, and we say a test cycle, first test cycle, and Steve and I would have argued against this, but we're just using analogies here. 500 milligrams, you're already using 150 milligrams on a very, very basic, keep it simple, stupid, beginner's stack of 500 milligrams of test. You're already using 150 milligrams more. And whether you like to admit it or not, the risk factors might be lower. There are still some risk factors involved in using injectables. So they're not quote unquote safer because you're not comparing like with like. You are always or almost always seeing more injectable milligram steroids than you are oral steroids. Now, of course, those arguments will be thrown out the window by the odd one or two, but we're talking typically here the average user. So there's all those kind of things. I think the big one here, Steve, would be arguably because we are stacking orals. As I said to Steve in the pre-show, that doesn't mean to say that we're using 2 orals at the same fucking time. That's possible. It could mean that over an 8-week period, and in fact, I've even started to think about doing this myself, Steve. I literally Sunday started using Debo, low milligram dose, 30 milligrams a day, 210 milligrams a week, with the idea of bulking up a little bit to increase my strength, and then that'd be for about 6 weeks, and then I would keep it going for another 2 weeks, but I might stack in a low dose of Anavar the last 2 weeks just to peak at my strength, which I'll get something from the Debo, the bulk, the size, the leverage, and a little bit of an increase in the strength, and then enhance the strength in the last couple of weeks to try and hit. I'm thinking actually probably 9 weeks max, purely and simply because I've got a very, very big number that I want to do on squats at the end of those 9 weeks. So I would be stacking orals for 2 weeks, but I would arguably stack orals for 9 weeks or 8 weeks, purely simply because I'd be running a singular oral at the beginning, but I would at the other end of those 9 weeks, it's still a stack, it's still a cycle. I would either switch over to, which was not what I'm doing, but I could switch over to just Anavar for the last 2 weeks. So it's still 2 orals, or run them side by side in those last 2 weeks. So it doesn't have to be multiple oral steroids at the same time. It can be one oral steroid at the beginning, a different oral steroid in the middle, and a different oral steroid at the end. It's still a stack. It's still running multiple orals. Now, as I said, there will be the naysayers. So what do you think on the idea, Steve, of the whole risk factor involved, the issues that people might want to talk about? And obviously, we're going to talk about managing those issues. But what do you think about the risk factors, et cetera, and the idea of stacking 2 orals, in your own opinion?
Yeah, and look, blood work doesn't lie. So I've seen people over the years. I've had, I've done consultations with people who've never touched a steroid in their life come to me, and I've had them go and get blood work done, and they've had bad liver numbers. They've had a history of substance abuse, alcohol, recreational drugs, or they've had a history, as Mobster said, they've been on over-the-counter drugs or prescription drugs for years and years and years. Some people take sleep medication every single night just to sleep. Some people take allergy medication every single day. Some people take very harsh things like prednisone, which is a catabolic steroid, day in and day out. I know people that have been on catabolic steroids for a year straight because their doctors put them on it as a last resort because they were suffering so much. Look, so the bottom line is, and on the flip side, I've seen people using orals off and on for years. I know people who have been using oral steroids since their early 20s, now and they're in their 40s and 50s, or they're even Mobster's age, and they've used them off and on, and their blood work is fine. They have resting heart rates that are like 48, 50. So they're in great shape. They're in top shape. I mean, very few people, they're in the top 1% when it comes to health, and they've been using oral. So look, blood work doesn't lie. And at the end of the day, with the nice thing about orals over injectables is that they're flexible. You can go on them, you can come off them. If there's a problem, you can come off. you know? So that's the advantage. When you're on injectables, it'll take weeks for these injectables to clear your system. But on orals, if there is a problem that comes up that you're concerned with your health, you can always come off. Also, they're flexible in the way you can use them. You can use them to kickstart a cycle. You can use them to finish a cycle. You can use them solo on by themselves, or you can use them stacked with injectables. There's so many different ways that you can throw in orals here and there. You can be halfway through a cycle and be like, let me add an oral to the cycle. There's people that do that. They're like, well, I'm not getting the type of results I want. I want to add something else to give the cycle a little punch. So let me get on some Debol or Anadrol or Superdrol or something. Any other oral that we're going to talk about, and they're able to push themselves to a higher level. So there's different ways to use orals. So to say that orals are an issue, that they're dangerous, that they're no good, you're missing out. You're missing out on a big part of bodybuilding. And look, the proof is in the pudding. As I said at the open, if you look at these professional stacks, these guys are using tons of orals. They're using orals at the start of their cycle. They're using orals at the middle of the cycle. They're especially using orals toward the end of the cycle. Winstrol, for example, almost all professional stacks, they'll throw in oral, even if they hate Winstrol, even if they hate that it makes them bald, even if they hate what it does to their joints, even if they hate the steroid, they still will use it toward the end because the guy next to you on stage is using Winstrol. So if you don't use Winstrol, you're not going to be as dry as that guy next to you. So it's almost mandatory that you need Winstrol. So to have the attitude, well, I'm not going to use orals, they're dangerous or they're no good, you're just screwing yourself. You're just shooting yourself in the foot. So you shouldn't have that type of mentality in life. It's the same mentality of, oh, I'm not going to date someone in this profession. I'm not going to date a blonde, or I'm not going to date a brunette. I'm not going to date this person. It doesn't make any sense. You're just handcuffing yourself, or I'm not going to date someone who's this race or ethnicity or this religion. Why? If it works for you and it works, and you're happy, what does it matter what you do? You've got to be flexible in life and be willing to do what's best for you, not what's best for some guru.
Yes, let me touch on that last point there, Steve, because that's something that's occurred to me, and I've got another one as well. So, for example, and we talk about this, some of these people that we're actually going to talk about are friends of ours. So don't let it be said, we're allowed to disagree. That's what friends do. Okay, so without naming a particular person I'm thinking of, but other people included, right? So sometimes you have to look at who is giving you the advice. You can go onto YouTube, you can go onto Reddit, you can go onto Twitter, God help us, and you can find people that are giving you advice. And one of the silly examples, Steve, is that back in the day, we know there was a lot of would-be gurus giving out information based on God knows what, because they had almost no references. This is especially true when we started discussing steroids on the internet. And as often as not, I mean, Steve and I have used this example before. It was some 15-year-old fat kid sitting in the basement of their mum's house. And they'd read a little bit about steroids, and they went onto the internet, they'd parrot something they'd read about, and they would come across as an expert. Okay, and then when you actually found a fucking photograph of them, as we eventually managed to do in these situations, when you start to realize that the expert was actually 15, 16, 17 years of age, and they just read a good book, it started to throw that kind of shit out the window. So sometimes, and Stevesmi and I could be an example of this. You say, what's our bias? Mobster's a big motherfucker. He likes to lift heavy weights. Of course he's going to recommend this. Of course he's going to recommend that. But I say that when I'm talking to you. Equally, Steve and I have always been low dose, cycle safely, look after yourself, get your blood test done, right? So whether we disagree or agree with buddies of ours that will say that oral steroids for more than 4 weeks is a crazy idea, stacking oral steroids is a bad idea, equally, we come with our bias, as do they. And what they want from their PEDs and the way that they stack and any risk factors they've had in their own life and their family's life will affect their decision making. The problem I'll actually argue is this, Steve. I am well aware, being a fan and historian of the sport, going back some years, and with information going back a very, very long time in my historical collection upstairs, of the kind of stories that used to circulate when I first became interested in training, and especially when I first became interested in using PEDs. And we would hear horror stories. We would see photographs. And some of this was doctors trying to help us, but they would actually use a cirrhotic liver, a liver of someone who's had cirrhosis of the liver. But was it because of steroids? Was it because of alcohol? Was it because of smoking? Was there other risk factors involved? Was it genetics? We'd hear people, oh, such a bodybuilder ended up on dialysis, and so on and so forth. I could think of a professional bodybuilder right now on dialysis. What's the one? Frank McGrath's only got one kidney. You know, that kind of situation. And yet people are thinking, myself included, he must at some point use steroids to enhance his physique to the level that we've seen it get to. And yet he's got a shunt in his chest, so you can see him wearing in t-shirts, but he must have used steroids. What the hell? So there's loads of stuff. So here's the thing that's kind of interesting, Steve, and noticeable. We have more information now than we've ever had before. We've got the same information access, probably enhanced in terms of our ability to go off and look at scientific data, look at medical journals, access to essays, access to discussions and debates and decisions and metadata and so on and so forth. Okay. Equally, as we know, Steve just mentioned that we've got better access now from users' blood tests. As an example, I've done a 50+ medical exam some years ago, my early 50s, and I had better results than the nurse that was doing the test, and that included lipids. And it was all part of a over 50 program for people in the valleys where I live, because the men of my age had worked down in the coal mines, and therefore they would die in 10 years more than they should do as a national average. I was included, although I wasn't born and brought up and hadn't worked here. So my results were quite good for what they was. Body mass index a little bit higher, but they could see that I worked out. And I've had that on previous medicals as well. Creatinine levels quite good and so on and so forth. So, you know, I might be a genetic freak. Equally, I might not just be abusing my body in a bunch of ways. And that includes dosage on orals. But what I was thinking, Steve, is that we are seeing arguably greater information to the risk and perhaps some of the issues that competing bodybuilders are having. Ironically, more than weightlifters and other athletes, we will see stories about this person dying or that person dying. What we're not seeing is more information coming onto the forums of any forum, where we're seeing people posting up really bad blood tests, although we have seen some in the past. We haven't seen a lot of those recently. We aren't seeing people that have had out and out terrible medical conditions, and yet arguably the dosages of steroids that people are using, including amateurs, are higher probably across the board than they ever have been, historically speaking, and so on and so forth. So the argument ought to be in that particular regards, we should see more problems. And I would actually say arguably we're seeing less. So there's that particular one. And also something else that I touched upon briefly with Stephen in the pre-show. We now have good information and good access, and it's actually part of what makes Para Pharma so good, to lab tests of products. But we didn't have that information back in the day. So one of the risk factors that might have been arguably an issue with using orals, and for that matter, injectable steroids back in the day, was piss poor dosing. Some of the users wouldn't have known because they never had the product tested, or the product not even been tested by the lab. It was not really a thing 20, 30 years ago. It's now very common with the better sources to see lab tests, not just by the company themselves, not by the sellers, but by the end user. That happens a lot more than it used to, and so on. So, for example, Steve, who knew what the fuck was in products 20, 30 years ago? Was it properly dosed? Was it toxic? Was it full of heavy metals? Christ almighty, we've seen photographs and videos of some of the labs 20, 30 years ago. We can show you, in fact, we've seen, when we've talked about approved sources before, the machinery, lab tech machinery that they were using, the production line set up, videos of how the production line was working and how the product was made and so on and stuff. You never saw that. You saw kitchen sink stuff. You saw Mexican, literally underground labs. You didn't know the name of the company. It came from a third world country, and so on and so forth. So I'd actually argue, Steve, in some ways, proved sources like Para Pharma produce a better quality, less toxic, more accurately dosed, and less likely to be contaminated products than ever before. It's certainly when we're talking about underground labs. So what do you think on that before we move on into the next section?
Yeah, so I mean, you've kind of organically moved us into the next section, Mobster, with this discussion, and then we talk about your health when it comes to orals. And that is the number one thing, as Monster mentioned, when it comes to your health, is know what goes in your body. And I think a big part of why oral steroids have taken such a bad hit, especially in the 90s and 2000s, was in those days, where were the people getting the orals from? They
Yeah.
were getting orals from some dude, in the back of the gym, who had the white van parked in the back of the gym, and everyone knew that this guy was the guy to go to. So where was he getting it from? They were probably put together in some person's, trailer in the middle of nowhere. And who knows what they're putting in there? The fillers that they were using itself were dangerous, not even counting what was
Steve,
in.
let me give you a quick
Go ahead.
example. Sorry to interrupt. There was a documentary about 5 or 10 years ago where it was about the whole ecstasy epidemic. And part of the documentary, they followed a person that was making a few quid, making and producing ecstasy pills for his local club scene. And he had bought a pill press off of eBay and was producing this without his mum and dad knowing. I think he had it hid in the back of the wardrobe. He was producing ecstasy tablets in his bedroom. And he wasn't much older than a teenager. He was in his early 20s. So the bedroom was a messy post teenage bedroom of someone that wasn't quite ready to leave home. And he was making £500 or £600, £1,000 a week on the side by producing pill pressed pills in his messy bedroom at his mum and dad's. And people will argue about using oral steroids. I would actually argue that you've got way more of a problem using someone who's making a fucking pill in a bedroom versus the idea of using an approved source like Para Pharma and the idea that there's a risk factor there. And that's without the actual physical toxicity of using an oral steroid and the effect on the body. So, yeah, I mean, guys, listen, you sometimes need to understand the whole anabolic steroid, PED industry, and we get it. We know that supplement companies will exaggerate and lie. We know that they will underdose. We know that there are UGLs and the fella with the bag in the trunk of his car that Steve's referred to. But equally, this is why we talk use an approved source, use a company. For example, Steve, when was the last time we heard of us on the forums talking about an approved source that someone had got an infection from? When was the last time, and you and I discussed this on another show, that we talked about using an approved source like Para Pharma where post-injection pain was a fucking bitch? And those things don't really seem to happen anymore. And I'm not just saying that because we were talking about Para Pharma today. They just don't. You could, guys, listeners, you can go and check these things for yourself. You could go out there and search for thousands of threads on a bunch of forums, including the Evo family, and say to me, "Oh, I found one mobster. I found one. Look at this. That's how bad it was." Okay, one out of thousands. So the risk factor, that issue, the idea of it isn't as big and is probably overplayed. But I get it, right? Anybody that says you've got to worry about these things is correct. We want you to be safe. We want you to manage any issues that might exist. And we're going to talk about, for example, let me translate this over, Steve. So you should be training in the gym. You should be doing cardio. This is the reasons why you listen to this show. Already, you are, quote unquote, stronger and or more muscular than someone in the street who does none of those things. You should be eating cleaner. You should be well hydrated. You should have a good idea of your percentage of body fat. Again, average Joe in the street, male or female, doesn't have those things. So already you're actually negating some of the things that would affect the average person. Those people would be quite critical of you using steroids, but here you are, lean, muscular, and arguably healthier. Then we get into the whole steroid thing. So the person, and this is always really weird and ironic, the number of percentage of people in the society that are on over-the-counter and prescribed medication is huge, much higher percentage than it used to be. Most of those powerful, stronger medications come with side effects each and of their own. Just read the white insert. And then we're talking about people drinking and smoking and using recreational drugs, like Steve said. So it's kind of weird that the person training, dieting, eating healthy, eating clean, meal prepping, gets criticism and is a risk issue because of the personality profile versus people that don't do those things, considered to be quote unquote normal people who are on medication, who don't train, who don't run and don't jog and don't row and don't play sports as much as they would like to think that they do, and eat crap and eat rubbish takeouts and have prepared meals rather than prepping food themselves, and have a drink at the weekend, and have too many glasses of wine. And those are the same people that say you're having an arguable issue for steroids. You are negating just with your actual process of being a bodybuilder and a trained athlete, much of those things. So the obvious stuff, and I'll touch on this now, Steve, in terms of being healthy when you're using orals, and this includes stacking orals. So number one would be a good, solid organ protector. And you know the kind of product that we're talking about, referred to in a bunch of other shows that we've done. Look at the ingredients, get something like that, and negate as many of the potential risk factors as you possibly can, especially if you start to increase the dosages above and beyond that, what arguably would be sensible dosages. So keep that in number one. Number two would be, and this makes a lot of sense when you're training and doing the lifestyle anyway, stay as hydrated as you possibly can. Steve, come in with some other sort of factors, for example, fasting, good nutrition, and so on.
Yeah, and you know, it goes hand in hand. You should go into cycle in good shape. You should go into cycle with already blood work. If you go into an oral cycle and you already have elevated liver values, you need to get that taken care of. If you've got elevated kidney issues, if you've got a bad heart already, if you just got a heart attack, you know, a year ago, maybe you shouldn't be using steroids at all. So it comes with common sense, exactly what you were saying. And look, at the end of the day, you know, there's some simple tips. You know, you got to use them smartly. Don't abuse them. Keep the cycles within reason. Use your support supplements, as you said, and make sure you get your blood work done. If you suspect something is wrong, listen to your body. Go get blood work done. And if the blood work shows that something is wrong, you got to readjust things. Maybe you got to lower the dosing. Maybe you got to come off. And if you do this, you'll be able to use oral steroids for years with success. So it really is not that complicated. You know, when comes to our body, we have this masculine, macho type of mentality in the bodybuilding world where it's like, oh, I'm a gorilla, I'm tough, you know, if something's wrong, I'll just push through it. No, you got to listen to
Yeah.
your body. If your body's giving you flashes that something is wrong, you got to listen to it. You got to learn to listen to it, and you got to respect your body. That's how you're going to be able to do this for years, like Mobster and I, versus flaming out. How many guys, most people who use steroids, by the way, are not like those of you listening to this show. Most of you use
No.
steroids don't want to be educated. Most of the people that use steroids don't succeed at this. They might use steroids for like 2 or 3 years, then quit. They'll do like
Yeah.
2, 3 cycles, then quit because they're not seeing any results. Most of the people who join gyms quit, okay, because they're not getting the results they want. They have
Life gets in the way, Steve. Career
yeah,
gets in the way. You change direction from bodybuilding to other things. That's perfectly normal behavior. Even in some of our listeners have been the same. Listen, as Steve's just said as well, Steve and I have been doing this a very long time. I am literally a week away from being in the game, not alive, but in training. 45 fucking years, Steve, right? 45 years. And Steve knows this, and some of our regular listeners know this. It's that crazy this shit is, Steve. I'm literally considering whether or not I can squat Hatfield squat with a safety bar 900 pounds in 9 weeks' time. And I'll be 60 and a tiny bit years old. It's fucking ridiculous, right? So that might make me an abnormal freak. I don't know. But equally, I've been doing this stuff a very, very long time. And from day one, I made a point of trying to be educated. Literally, I think I still got the 2 steroid books I booked. I ended up speaking to both the 2 well-known gurus here in the UK and getting sensible advice. And I've been out and had drinks, got pissed, got drunk with one of them, and the other one was super healthy. They were both crazy helpful, sorry, Steve, in terms of the advice they gave to me. And in my own particular way, I've ended up in a position of being able to talk about historically their impact and so on and so forth. And looked at other gurus, seen what people did, seen how mistakes were being made, and so on and so forth. So that's the reason why Steve and I get to do these shows. Steve's been training, I'm going to say just for Steve, he's been training 30-something years. And we've actually kicked ass. Steve's bench press is not a million miles away from mine. I think it's like a 5 or 10 pound difference, Steve, between my very best and your very best. And I'm a fucking gorilla, as Steve said, by comparison. Steve stays in great condition all year round. And Steve is huge on the blood test thing. So we've tried to, just for our own personal reasons, stay as healthy as we possibly can. We've tried to give that information out to other people as much as we possibly can. And we are very much about the long term, because it would be very easy to suggest you can do what the fuck you like for short periods of time, add 20 pounds of water, look like shit, get gyno, and we don't give a fuck. But we're not like that. We're much more long-term in our point of view. We're much more looking back and learning from history, not making mistakes, and so on and so forth. So hopefully even if, as we will go talk about shortly, we talk about using orals and multiple orals, 1, 2, or even 3, we're still doing it with half an eye on the best way to do that and mitigate the side effects and keep you healthy and give you great results, and so on and so forth. And here's the thing, right? And this applies to Steve, it applies to myself, and it applies to a lot of our listeners. Like Steve said, you can adjust on the fly. You will change direction as to what you want from steroids and your training over the time that you are lifting. So just because you want to bulk up right now and we give you a bulk cycle and you bulk up and you love it, and then, but actually the results are great, but you don't like the fact you're 15 or 20 pounds, right, I'm going to lose a bit of weight. This is what happens. Your goals move. I never trained for strength for probably the first 20 years, Steve. It's only the last 24 years that I've trained for strength. And so my targets have shifted. What I wanted from bodybuilding has changed, and so on and so forth. This is the same for you. The one great analogy I'll use here, Steve, before we move on, is that there are many, many tools in the toolbox. We're hopefully today going to give you the right tools, including multiple orals, to get you where you want to go, using those tools as safely as we possibly can. So whether it's an injectable stack that we're talking about, oral stack that we're talking about, how to train in the gym, it's all going to be using the tool in the right way with ancillaries, Steve, managing your blood pressure, don't let things get out of control, being self-aware in terms of any issues that you might be having, and so on and so forth. Those little tricks, those little techniques, the little hints that we give you from time to time are part of all of these podcasts. So you need to listen to some of the others, because we try to make sure those bits of information are in every single show. Shall we move on to a few comments about different orals and how we would stack them, Steve, if we were to run it with another oral?
Yeah, so let's get into a big segment here, Mobster, and let's talk about the different Para Pharma orals and how we should be stacking them. Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, look, the number one, Steve, ironically, and I've said this on other shows, which is Anadrol 50, oxymethylone, 100 tabs, 50 milligrams a tablet, which is produced by Para Pharma. Ironically, the dosages that we typically recommend as a singular steroid, never mind if we were stacking it, is actually less than it can be used for medical reasons. And I was quite surprised about this a few months ago when I went away and had a point and saw that someone had mentioned it. I thought, what's that about? And checked it out. And literally what happened there was that there's a sort of a milligram per kilogram of body weight. I weigh right now, Steve, well over 140 kilos. So if I had the medical condition that is treated with Anadrol, I'd actually be using 140 or up to 140 milligrams, whereas typically we're looking at 30 to 50 milligrams, and that's precisely the reason why this particular product comes in a 50 milligrams, Steve. So that's number one. Now, we know how, and we've discussed on other shows how Anadrol works, and if you respond well to Anadrol, you will fucking love it. Now, let's assume, for argument's sake, Steve, the person that's going to run Anadrol wants to bulk a little bit, and just like I said earlier on with my own particular suggestion of a stack for myself, which I'll discuss later on, I might run Anadrol if I responded well to it for 6 weeks, and then I might run Anadrol, keeping it at the 50 milligrams, and add in, for example, the next oral, and in fact there's an extra choice, but I'll just go with the first choice of Anavar at 10 milligrams. Now the reason for this is thus: Anadrol can give you, as Steve said on other shows, dry gains, especially if you respond well to it. And it has a certain particular look about it and a certain particular feel in terms of what you like when you're using Anadrol. And again, I'm just thinking here, Steve, I'm saying 6 weeks. What would you run in terms of length of a Anadrol cycle before you added anything to it? I'm thinking 6 weeks, 50 milligrams, and then an additional 30 milligrams per day of Anavar would be a great stack for me, for example, especially if I responded better to Anadrol. But what about the length of the stack with Anadrol? Would you do 4 weeks, 6 weeks?
It'd be hard. It'd be hard to get it to 6 weeks. Anadrol is one of those. The side effects are quite tricky when it comes to Anadrol, so you really got to be careful when you start stacking it with things. So this would be one that, I think you made a good suggestion there with Anavar. I'd also look at Tevol as well. You definitely want to
Yeah,
stack it with something very
Debo was my
mild.
other suggestion, Steve. I was thinking maybe then, and this is a great one for listeners to think about. 4 weeks of
Yeah.
Anadrol 50, especially if you have potential issues with the side effects. And then the latter part of the cycle, you're already going to be hard, carrying a bit of muscle, more of a polish and a finish to the cycle in terms of 2 to 4 weeks of Anavar. Again, I would actually keep the dosage a little bit low, using the 10s here at 30 milligrams a day. And also for me, and again, everybody who listens to these shows regularly knows that I'm a big fan of this. I can see me getting that extra little bit of strength at the end of the cycle, which I would absolutely love. What about that as an idea?
Yeah, you could go that route for sure. And there's certain of these steroids that I would not recommend stacking together or stacking with other harsh steroids, and Anadrol is definitely one of them. So I like that suggestion, Mobster. You can either go 4 weeks with the Anadrol. You can actually, I like Anadrol personally at 25 milligrams. So I like it a little lower. I wondered too, depending on your size. If you're a big dude, mobster size, then 50 milligrams. But if you're a smaller dude, you're half mobster size, you're in the high 100s, then 25 would do you good as well. And that would actually be a little better, in my view, when it comes to stacking. You could go ahead and stack the Anavar on top of it. You don't have to separate them. So you can actually run them a little bit together, but that's an option as well. But Anadrol is
On the,
really, I was going
yeah,
to say
sorry, Steve.
Anadrol is very unique because it's already a DHT derivative. But it's very unique because it also binds to estrogen. So it's almost like already mixing a bunch of steroids together because it does
Yeah,
so many different things. It's androgenic, it's anabolic, it binds to SHBG, it's a DHT derivative, it binds to estrogen. So it's like mixing 4 or 5 different steroids together already. So it's almost like you're using a blend when you use Anadrol already. So it's a very, very unique steroid. I highly recommend if you haven't used it before and you like to bulk and you like size and you like strength, that you give it a shot sometime.
I have seen, Steve, just before we move on to the next one, I have seen an Anadrol and a Debo product. So that suggests that there are customers, users that actually want to get as big as a fucking house in a very short period of time, but they was dosed at 25 milligrams of each for a 50 milligram total. So that's just to give you an idea of what some users have asked companies to produce, and therefore they might be out there. I wouldn't recommend that maybe to a first time user. I would prefer you to have a good idea of how you respond to either of those products. And again with that, I would really be on top of monitoring just how fast I was fucking growing. It sounds great, it really does. Put on 15 or 20 pounds, but I've done it, and it's uncomfortable outside. It's great in the gym, Steve, amazing in the gym, but it's not so good in doing everything else, moving around the house, climbing stairs, walking about and shit. So for me, I think if I was one of those people that ruled like a motherfucker, I'd actually keep the dosages low. Like Steve, 25 milligrams sounds fine to me, Steve. Anavar, I like, and again, there's two options here with an Anavar 10 that I've already mentioned and the Anavar 50. I like Anavar. Everybody knows I like Anavar. So, for example, again, I'm thinking of the average user here, Steve. If it works for me, even strength gains tend to be kind of mild. And of course, not every person is doing listening to this show wants to be huge. Not every person that wants to do this thing kind of strong. So, for example, Steve, and I'll just have a very quick look while I'm talking. You've got the option of running this with Winstrol as a lean gain, 5 pounds of muscle maybe. And for example, again, Steve, I'm thinking 10 to 30 milligrams a day of Anavar 10, or you could push it, as I say, Anavar Solo would be great. Anavar, the 50 milligrams works for me fine. But then also mix that in with the oral Winstrol 10, and they also do an oral Winstrol 50. But I'm thinking 30 milligrams of each of those on a daily basis as a nice, lean, hard muscular gainer. You're not going to bulk up. You're not going to blow up like on an Anadrol and D-Bol combination, but certainly adding good quality hard tissue and, of course, that little bit of stretch. What do you think about running that as well, Steve? Oh, and also, well, again, those two, do you know what, Steve? 6 weeks, 8 weeks. I don't think 30 milligrams of either of those two for 6 to 8 weeks is excessive, from my opinion, because the doses are quite low. The side effects, especially with the Anavar, are very small. That's the reason why we talk about it being quote unquote, I say steroids. 6 to 8 weeks would be a push for me, I think. And again, why do we see Winstrol? Why do we see Anavar competing cycles, and especially competing cycles, amateur or pro at the end? For exactly the same reason Steve said earlier on. Quicker in, quicker out, the flexibility, the ability to manipulate, and again, hard, dry muscle. So what do you think on that, Steve?
Yeah, and I would take it a different direction. Instead of doing the Anavar and Winstrol for cutting and drying, I would do Anavar and Dianabol, and I have done this stack before. So I'm going to take a little thing off of you, Mobster, and switch it around. This would be a good stack because you're getting a nice yin and yang effect. So you're getting a more wet compound with Dianabol, quite a bit more wet compound, and a dry compound with Anavar. So you're mixing them, you're getting a good stack together where you're mixing two opposites. So it's a situation where opposites attract. And this will be a good one for those of you who want good, lean to moderate muscle mass, but also some cutting effect. So maybe a recomp effect, maybe I say a lean to moderate bulking effect, but nothing where it's like crazy. And the way you kind of control the water retention would be keeping the Dianabol at 10 to 20 milligrams a day and keeping the Anavar higher, 20 to 30 milligrams a day. So
Yes.
whatever dose you run the Dianabol, run the Anavar more, like 10 milligrams or 15 milligrams more, and that will kind of offset the Dianabol effects. It actually will help with the Dianabol water retention issue. So that's a good one. I've used that just as a quick 5 to 6 week little cycle that I kind of threw in a situation where maybe I wanted to go more high volume in the gym, and do some variations of workouts and really get a nice pump. The pump on this stack, Mobster, is
Yeah.
tremendous. And the pump on the Anavar and Winstrol too would have crazy pumps as well if you run them together. So both of these stacks would have crazy good pumps either way.
Something I should have mentioned earlier on, listeners, and it's just occurred to me, funny enough, I've started including this, and Steve and I have done shows on this recently. The topic of the show is called stacking orals. It doesn't necessarily say stacking oral steroids. So, for example, Steve, and I'll jump in ahead slightly here when I say this, but you could actually run this with any of the orals that we're talking about, and arguably you should run it with an injectable cycle. That's including Proviron in the mix there, Steve. 25 milligrams is how it comes through, 50 tablets from Para Pharma, 25 milligrams a day. And ironically, it didn't occur to me until we started talking, I'm actually doing this right now. I'm running, as I've already said, a low dose Dianabol. I might increase that, but I'm also using 25 milligrams a day. So I am stacking two orals even as we do this show. So that's something you can run with injectable steroids and an oral steroid, and arguably, Steve, oral steroid combination. And the reason that you would include Proviron is because its ability to free up testosterone. There's more free test. It basically is a way of enhancing the stack that you're doing. The other steroids, the other PEDs that you're using, but specifically the ability to enhance the production or release free testosterone, which basically gives more bang for your buck. So what are we looking at there, Steve? Proviron, 25 milligrams a day, with whether it's an injectable stack, whether it's an oral stack, running through the whole length of the cycle. I wouldn't mess with that. And it's something that Steve and I, as I say, we've done shows on this recently. We've talked about enhancing your story. We talked about the benefits of using Proviron. And again, it should have occurred to me earlier in the show that I'm actually ironically doing this already. I'll go back one, Steve, here, and I'm going to include this purely and simply because it's an orals and not an oral steroid show. So, for example, and I'm not a huge fan of this, as Steve and I did a show on this just recently. But again, if you're looking to get lean, you could be looking at Anavar, you could be looking at Winstrol. You could also be using, and it's not a steroid, of course, clenbuterol, Steve, 40 micrograms, 100 tablets from Para Pharma. And this would be definitely, you're not using this for bulking, you're not using this for strength. You are looking for condition. You are looking to lose weight. You're looking specifically to lose body fat and to get in shape. Recommended dosages for clenbuterol vary from, and in fact, you could probably go half a pill here, Steve, start off just to see how you manage Clen if you've never used it before. So maybe even as low as 20 micrograms, which would be half a pill per day, just to see how you feel. But typically, you're looking between 40, 80, and 120. And again, something that Steve and I would agree on with this one, most users, and especially if you're going to the 120 milligrams there or there, sorry, micrograms there or thereabout per day, might feel too much of the effects of Clen. One don't have to stay at their dose, but can ease back down to 80 micrograms again, sorry, for a few days, for a week at a time before going back up again. The overall length, Steve, is something that I would probably want to debate. What would you run a cycle if you included clenbuterol? How long would you run the clenbuterol for? The full length of a 6 or an 8 week cycle, or for just 2 to 4 weeks of a cycle, which I know we've discussed in the past?
Yeah, cleanse, it's gonna be pretty hard to run it that long, buddy. I know some pros they do run it long periods, but really 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off is gonna be your best bet that you could do it that way. It's pretty brutal to run it longer than that,
Yeah,
so I wouldn't run it longer than that. Then and while we're on that subject too, there's some oral steroids from Para Pharma that you shouldn't be stacking. And I mentioned, Anadrol earlier. Very, very, very risky to stack Anadrol, but it can be done, and some people do it, as Mobster said. But a
yeah,
couple more options that you probably shouldn't be used stacked is going to be Oral Tren and Superdrol. And
yes,
I've used Superdrol, and I talked about it a lot. I've used it a couple times. Let's say you only have like a certain amount of time. You really want you're hitting a plateau and you want to bust through that plateau. Superdrol will get you over the top, but it's very toxic in the body. So to stack Superdrol doesn't make any sense. It's just too toxic in the body. So that's one not to stack. So if you're gonna run Superdrol, run it by itself. Don't even stack it with an injectable. You gotta run it just by itself. So just keep in mind that not all of these orals should be stacked. But we pretty much covered the different.
sorry, the only thing I was going
Yep.
to ask in that regard, Steve, because actually we got Turinabol as well. Would you run, for example, and as I suggested earlier on, it doesn't have to be stacked at the same time, but could you run, for example, 4 to 6 weeks of Superdrol and then switch over to another oral option as a way of running a stack without actually running two PEDs, two anabolic oral
I don't know,
steroids at
buddy.
the
It's
same
pretty
time?
brutal because on Superdrol
You want that time off?
both times I ran and I had to stop after 3 weeks. You just get
Yeah.
way too fatigued. You get insomnia. You feel like shit on it. Your numbers are off the charts. Your blood pressure's off the charts. So it's really one of those things where you got to come off of it completely and not use anything else. So I don't think it's gonna work. I think it's gonna be too much pressure on the body where your body. I just don't see it being. I think it's gonna be counterproductive.
I suspect it's something that you and I wouldn't necessarily get on with, but we do know that Superdrol still has its fans, still has its people that
Oh
like.
yeah.
Arguably, Steve, they even like how they feel. I've even used this thing before. I'm not a huge fan of feeling toxic, and yet I know that there are some users where the way that they feel, the idea that this stuff is definitely fucking working because of how they feel, even though that I might describe that and you might describe it as a quote unquote toxic sensation. And I don't know how much longer I can last on this, and yet loving the results. And some people think like that. That's maybe a little bit of the matter, I think. What about Turinabol, Steve? Stacking that with anything else? How would you dose that if you stacked it, and for how many weeks?
Yeah, so we briefly mentioned Toronto Bowl earlier in the podcast, but I don't think we mentioned it on this segment. So let's talk a little bit about Toronto Bowl. So Toronto Bowl is very similar to Anavar, but like a couple notches weaker. And Toronto Bowl is a good one. I've used it in a stack. It's mild. So you can run Toronto Bowl anywhere from I'd say 20 to 40 milligrams a day. And then you could go two different ways with it. You can either stack something else that's a drier, like Anavar with it, or you could stack something that's a wet compound like D-Bol. And I've done it that way as well. And it's worked really well. I've done 20 milligrams of the T-Bol and 20 milligrams of the D-Bol together. So it comes out to 40 milligrams. And let me tell you something, it was a really good stack. I got some good mass building and I got hard on that stack. So it really stacks well for that reason. How about you?
Let me touch on the Turinabol again, Steve. Something I've said on previous shows, and I said it's kind of weird. Although we've mentioned how effective it is a bunch of times ourselves, it's kind of strange in that it doesn't get the love that it should. And what do I mean by that, listeners? I said because I've gone on and looked at other steroid gurus, look at other people handing out steroid advice, and some of these people, obviously, as we said earlier, on parrot bullshit and just repeat information that they've read, and others I've got some serious experience of one or two, and I mean one or two, and I'm thinking of one person in this country who's actually college educated, qualified, and gives advice on PED use to very big organizations, Ministry of Defense, police, social services, and a lot. And himself and a few of the others properly rated and respected gurus love Turinabol. They love it. I mean, it's one of those sort of guru secrets. It isn't a secret as such. It's just that, you know, every single guru says it's vastly underrated. We know that what it was developed for, East German use. We know that it was given paranathleticism without exaggerating the physiques of the East German athletes, and later on, obviously, other athletes got hold of it and use it the same way. So we know that it's effective. Relatively mild, arguably, and again, comparable to any other particular regard. And the one thing I think it's outstanding at, Steve, and we've discussed in previous shows when we talked about it, is the ability for it to enhance to a small degree your cardiovascular ability. In other words, you're adding weight, you're adding muscle. That's actually going to impact somewhat your normal level of cardiovascular ability. Turinabol, as part of a cycle, is actually going to moderately enhance it, or at least, arguably, Steve, maintain as much of it as possible. So if I threw on 10 pounds of tissue tomorrow, it's going to fuck my cardio up. And it would take me, it's typically taken me, every time I've gained any serious amounts of weight, about 3 months for me to get used to the new body weight. It becomes my new sort of set level. Now, if I add a moderate amount of muscle on cycle, and I might not even want to keep all that muscle, all that weight, Turinabol is going to help me manage that. It's going to make the time that I adapt quicker, and it's going to keep some level of cardiovascular from being lost versus me not using this particular product. And again, like Steve says, 20 to 40 milligrams a day. And again, so we are seeing interest in it. We are starting to see it included in cycles, but it's very much like, I think, for example, when we discussed Primo, Steve, when it's making almost a comeback back in the 70s and 80s, huge, and then it seemed to fall off the radar for 20 or so years, a little bit longer. And then more recently, as we see people that like to cut and hold on to muscle tissue, Primo's making a comeback. Turinabol is finally getting the attention that it deserves. It's not number 1, number 2, and number 3, but it is becoming a more popular PED as part of an overall cycle and stack. And certainly something, for example, Steve, in terms of using Tren and other harsher drugs, and especially when you're gaining excesses of body weight with orals, I could see me, for example, if I was on a massive weight gain, but I wanted to keep my cardiovascular, first on a SUST DECA cycle, Steve, using T-Bol. I don't know necessarily that I'd want to stack it with anything else. Certainly, if I did, it would probably be a milder steroid. And again, let's talk about, as Steve said earlier on, the side effects of Anavar could be horrendous pumps. There are ways of managing those pumps, of course, but I think T-Bol would help me, at least, even if I was going to get those horrible pumps, to at least still function with repetitive, high-volume work, etc. So that's definitely one way to look at it, Steve. Anything else before we move on to talk about Para Pharma?
I think we covered it all. And, look, we're going to have a lot more discussions like this in the future. So if you have any suggestions, let us know. Come on the forums, let us know. Let us know on the comments section wherever you're listening to, and we'll definitely talk about it in the future.
Yeah, what do you think about stacking orals, listeners? Have you got suggestions? Have you stacked orals? We'd definitely be interested in that. I want to talk about Para Pharma quality, Steve, before we finish the show. So, look, guys, anytime I talk about Para Pharma or any of our approved sources, I talk about certain particular things. So, it's a great example. You go on the Para Pharma website and you look at the products. You see that they are a professional company. You see, funny enough, Steve, that they've gone out of their way to actually make their products look a little bit different from the rest of the market. Some people have their own specific design. Some people moderate the designs. You'll see a lot of sort of colorful 3 or 4 colors labels and kind of almost sweetie-like looking. Others copy over-the-counter and prescribed medication in that they like to look specifically like medication. I like the way that Para Pharma, Steve, even with the holograms, etc., has actually gone, for example, with the sachets, a black label. It's just different, it's distinct, and everything looks like they put a little bit of effort into it. So that's just literally the presentation. I talked about on a show recently where I said one company, and it wasn't an approved source, so I went on their website, and the fucking labels were wonky on the products that they'd taken photographs of to present for you, the customer, to look at with consideration to sell. If you can't even get the fucking labels right, if your labels are wonky, Steve, I don't care how nice they are, and that's what you're presenting, God knows what the ones that you didn't choose look like. So that's horrendous. Something we discuss again and again and again is the idea of feedback and reviews and so on and so forth. So we say, go on the forums, put literally Para Pharma into the search engine. And I think right now, Steve, there's half a dozen I can think of. Certainly 4 that are active right this minute. And that's just literally off the top of my head as we record this show. Not even me doing any research. Of live logs where members of the forums are using Para Pharma products. And you can go on listener and look for those logs yourself and see for yourself the success or not of how those members are performing. And I'm telling you now, listeners, if they've got their food prep on and we're kicking their ass as far as getting their backsides down to the gym and training, and they're using Para Pharma products, they are proving successful. Whether they're getting lean and we can see more abs, a broader back, better shoulders, better arms, or just straight good for old fashioned adding muscle and getting stronger, Steve, you can guarantee to see that. Something that we discuss again and again and again when we do these shows is we talk about specifically lab tests. Para Pharma's own website has lab tests you can look at. And these will be in-house or sent out from the production facility and off to an independent lab for testing. And I believe the ones on the website there, Steve, are independently tested. So they're not even tested by a quality control or an in-house tester. They've been sent outside of their production facility for someone else to test, and then the results come back. That way you're not getting influence within the company to influence the way that the results are presented. The best and most optimal, in our opinion, and I think the listeners would agree with this, Steve, would be purely independent. And we know that such tests have taken place. Now, we could talk about the forum tests that we've seen, right, and they exist, and I'm going to touch on that in a moment, but you could also go to other forums and other places and look for those tests for yourself. You can see, for example, where the sheer number of forums and the sheer number of sources of information that recommend Para Pharma, not just Steve and I, not just on the Evo family forums, but many, many places. But let's go back to the Evo family of forums just for a second and look at the following. Right? We quoted this example multiple times. It remains true from the last time we talked about it. It's going to remain true today. Independent testing by a forum member at their own expense. I believe we're looking at in excess of $1,000. That's without the cost of the products themselves. And he bought these I think it was 1 or 2 products from a bunch of approved sources for a total of 10 products at his own expense. And I don't think he even used the same source to buy the different brands from the different overall approved sources. So he used different places to gather the products together. He then sent them all off, all 10 of them, for independent testing, again at his expense. So he's not only is he paid for the products, probably the best part of $500 to $1,000, Steve, he's probably spent another $1,000. He could still have his products back later on. And he's certainly got the sort of feedback that he wanted. He's then spent another $1,000, I think it might be slightly more, getting the products independently tested. He then posted the results of every single one of these tests, one after another, multiple posts in the same thread, with the full-blown, full-scale certificates for us to look at. The same lab tested all the products, and every single company's product that used, every approved source product that you used, all 10 products passed, meaning every single one was within reach of or 100% accurate to, and I actually know the numbers because I've done this off the top of my head before. The lowest was 97%, and I believe it was 97, 98, and 99, pretty much across the board. Let's call that 98% accurate for every single product that he had tested. All 10 products passed. And I actually said this on last couple of shows recently, Steve. The pharmaceutical industry actually has a lower percentile allowance or deviation from, for example, again, Advil, ibuprofen, 200 milligram pill can be as low as 180 milligrams or as high as 220 milligrams of the allowance. Now, it should be closer to the 200. The percentage that the products that we're talking about that tested deviated by 3% as a maximum and typically 2% as a maximum. That's less than the pharmaceutical industry allowance. And one of the favorite phrases that Steve and I have repeated on these shows was he actually thought 2 of the products would fail. He thought we were looking at 80%, 75% or worse. He said, I legitimately thought that of the 10 products that were tested, 8 would come back fine, 2 would be a little bit fine. I actually thought that was going to be kind of decent. He was quite surprised when every single product, including Para Pharma, was as close as possibly can be, and in fact better than the quality that we was going to expect from the pharmaceutical industry, never mind companies that are producing performance-enhancing drugs to be sold to listeners like yourself. So I thought that was absolutely fucking amazing, Steve. Any final thoughts before I finish off the show?
Yeah, I think you summed it up perfectly, Mom. So, look, I'll just say thing. One of the things that pisses me off out there are liars, grifters, cheats, and there's nothing worse than running a cycle and finding out halfway through your cycle that you got cheated. That because what you ordered isn't really what you ordered. We see that, at least you see that all the time back in the day.
Yeah.
And there was nothing we could do about it because this was what we had access to. Now, Mobster just explained it to us. Now we can send stuff out to be tested. So if you want to fuck me over and try to cheat me, guess what we're going to do on the forum? We're going to expose your ass. We're going to expose your ass as being a crook and as being a cheat. So don't fuck with our members. And this is why Para Pharma is loved by members, because Para Pharma, when you buy something for Para Pharma, you are getting what you order. There's no games. There's no BS. So that's why we like Para Pharma. And this is why we open our arms to Para Pharma. And we have several different excellent brands on our forums. And you can always come on the forums to find out where to get Para Pharma and these other brands as well. But Para Pharma, one of the best brands you could possibly get. They're very popular and they're a growing brand. They have everything you possibly need. So come on the forum and we'll tell you exactly how to get Para Pharma. Don't be shy out there.
Definitely, listeners. Thank you very much. Please note, we're not doctors and the opinions are ours. It's our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. A podcast of informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment apply.